What's going on, Salt Strong Nation? Wyatt and Tony here to talk to you guys about summer redfish tackle. We did a video on this last year and we've been getting a lot of questions, even on the old video. So we wanted to do an updated version, give you guys some recent trends we've been seeing and kind of go through our day and how our tackle changes for different types of spots, different presentations, everything you guys need to know about what you should be throwing for redfish right now. So I'm going to toss it over to Tony, starting out in the very beginning of your day, right when you're getting on the water. What do you have tied on to get onto these fish just right off the bat?
Yeah, so first thing in the morning is going to be like prime time in the summertime because you want to get out there before that heat starts to really get to the fish and get to you, because if you're uncomfortable fishing, it's just not going to be a productive day. So with it being low light conditions, top water is going to probably be the first thing I throw. I'll always have this tied up in the summertime, at least on one of my rods. And I kind of use that rod as a utility rod. I usually have three rods with me. I'll have a top water tied up, I'll have a jig head, and then I'll have like a weedless hook. And that top water rod is usually what I'm switching out lures on. But first thing in the morning, moonwalker, top water lure definitely can get the job done because it's low light. It creates splash on the water, helps draw those fish in, especially in the summertime. Water conditions are usually a little bit dirtier than, let's say, in the spring or in the wintertime, just because you get a lot of runoff and all that. So top water would probably be my number one. And if they're short striking top water first thing in the morning, if they're just smacking it and missing it all the time, I'll actually switch over to Slam Shady Bomber. This is a 5-inch paddle tail and that bigger profile, because when it is low light conditions, you want something in the water that puts out a little bit more vibrations so those fish can dial in on it. So the Bomber can work first thing in the morning and it can work throughout the day, especially the later we get into summertime. When the bait profiles are getting a little bit bigger, this larger paddle tail can definitely help get those fish's attention.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree any more than that. Especially in the summer, it starts getting up in the 100 degrees, towards the middle of the morning, and even going into the afternoon. It's so hot, it seems like those fish get a little bit more lethargic. So that feeding window is really concentrated first thing right when the sun rises. So I would agree with you. Definitely, I've got my top water in front of me. I was going to talk about it. In fact, this one got hit by a redfish recently and had the eye knocked off of it. But yeah, this is my go-to for reds early in the morning. I like to work these like really close to those grass banks, whether you're fishing in marshes or you're fishing, along spoil islands on grass flats. It seems like redfish in the summer, they love to get up really shallow first thing in the morning and press fish up against these banks. So they're just kind of like pinning them up against the wall and working that top water right along that bank. And, maybe half a foot to a foot of water is perfect for these fish because it's almost eye level with them. In fact, you'll see a lot of their backs coming out of the water. When I see that, it just to me signals top water because that's where fish are expecting to attack their prey. Most of that mullet and everything's kind of riding up at the surface when it's that shallow. So that's the most natural presentation I've found is top water. And I know a lot of times we talk about it not being the best or most natural presentation, but I feel like summer, early morning, there's not a more natural presentation you could go with. You get out there and the sun hasn't even risen. Really, the only way that there's activity in area is because you're seeing those splashes even before the sun's up. So I feel like that top water is probably the best thing to use early morning. But I would agree with you that Bomber will also work if you run it really hard against the top. I'll fish it without I've got on my 2.0, which I'll talk about a little bit later, one of these Hoss hooks. I'll use one of the weightless bass hooks and burn that Bomber across the surface, and I'll have reds chase it down and smash it like it was a top water. But how are you retrieving it for the reds? Because I like a little bit of a slower walk that lets it kind of, I guess, turn a little bit. What's your ideal retrieve when you're working that moonwalker?
Yeah, with top waters, I see that, a lot slower of a walk, a less aggressive walk with the top water works better for redfish. First, like snook and trout, I'm, cranking that thing like crazy, trying to make it splash as much as possible. But it seems like the reds don't like that as much as just a subtle, really slow walk with that moonwalker.
Yeah, no, I would agree. Especially with trout, I would say you get those really erratic, 1, 2, 3 pops with the top water. That signals, a reaction strike from those trout. But I agree with you. The reds, they like kind of a slow, almost monotonous head turn from that top water. I don't know if it's just easier for them to track or whatever, but those redfish seem to follow along with that a lot easier. So once the sun's up, we're getting away from top water. It's really hot. Maybe the fish are staying shallow. Maybe they're starting to move a little bit deeper. Where are you going to your presentations once you're moving away from the top water? Those fish aren't blowing it up anymore, but you know they're still either in the area or maybe you're changing spots. What's your next plan of action for redfish?
So it'll really depend on the conditions that'll determine what type of presentation I want to go with. If it's like flat calm, usually in the summertime in the morning, it is glass flat calm out there until the winds start picking up and the storms start showing up a little bit later in the morning and the afternoon. So when it is dead calm, I like a very finesse presentation, something like a shrimp lure, artificial shrimp lure, or a jerk shad. So for example, I've got the power prawn here. This is the larger version. This is basically the original version size. It's about 4.5 to 5 inches, I believe. Then we have the smaller version. So depending on the conditions, again, if it's really clear water, clean water, flat calm, I'll go with the smaller junior version of the Power Prawn USA. And if it's dirty water, maybe a little bit of a ripple on the surface, I'll go with the bigger one. Again, same thing we were talking about earlier with the bomber. A bigger presentation in either low light or dirty water can help those fish hone in on that bait better because it's larger. It creates a bigger disturbance in the water, so they can find it. Then if it's dirty water and it's, let's say, the wind's blowing pretty good, usually in the summertime we want to fish those areas that the wind's blowing into because it'll help push bait over there. I'll go with a paddle tail. And again, depending on how dirty the water is, if it's pretty clean, I'll go with a smaller paddle tail, like the Slam Shady 2.0. This color works really well in dirty water, clean water, shallow water, deep water, just depending on how you rig it up. But if it is dirty, the water's really murky, I'll go with the bomber and just reel it really slow using whatever weight I need to keep it down low on the bottom. That's going to be key too, is keeping that bait low in the strike zone. So definitely want to have it rigged up the right way.
No, yeah, I completely agree. And you're right. As it starts to get a little bit later in the day, you got to kind of move to a little bit more of a finesse presentation. Early in the morning, those fish, they can't see as well. It's a good time for them to be feeding, but they're more apt to make mistakes because they can't see stuff. I agree. Going and downsizing as it gets a little later in the day, fish are able to look at a lure a little bit better. There's more light. The chances are they've already fed, so they're not, as aggressive on baits, and you really need to be able to trick them. To me, as it starts to get later in the day, I can see a little bit better. I like to do some sight fishing if the conditions allow for it. And I think the best lure to do that with, and I've demonstrated this in a bunch of my insider reports for those of you who have watched recently, but this 2.0 absolutely crushes it for redfish. And all I'm going to do is, if I see a red, maybe if I'm blind casting, I use the exact same retrieve. But if I'm looking at a redfish, my ideal scenario is to throw it in front of that red and retrieve it within a foot of its face. Let that lure roll past it. And once it gets a couple inches past that redfish's face, I'll either let it drop from that constant roll, or I'll give it one very slight twitch up. So it's going to make that lure change levels, either up or down. And usually what will happen is as that lure drops, either from when it pops up and goes down, or when it's dropping straight on the retrieve, if it was a little high in the column, that's usually when I see that redfish jump on it. So if I'm blind casting, same situation. I'm throwing at potholes. A lot of times you will find reds in the summertime hanging out over sand instead of the grass. It seems like that sand is a little bit cooler. You'll see them down on the bottom. So I like to throw at potholes really heavily if I'm fishing those grass flats and let that lure drop over those potholes. Usually that's when I'm going to get my strike. But 2.0 is usually my go-to in that situation. But again, I am fishing a lot of cleaner water. And here in Texas, we lost a lot of our mangroves in the freeze last year. So there's not a lot of wind protection really anywhere. So our water is usually pretty churned up. So I tend to stick with the paddle tails a little bit more than a lot of the jerk baits or those baits that are a little bit more visual. I try to get some sort of vibration in the water. So if you're fishing areas that don't have a lot of wind protection, I would say maybe default to a paddle tail. But another really good option, if you're fishing a little later on in the day and the water is dirty, is a spoon. And I like normally a 1/4 ounce spoon for your average size redfish. But what's happening in the summer is you've got a lot of pinfish, you've got a lot of shad, you've got just a lot of small bait in the area. And I like to run this when there's a lot of grass floating. So if you're dealing with clumpy grass or some of that turtle grass that's floating and has died from the heat, this works really well because you can pull it through that grass. And I learned this retrieve actually watching one of Luke's insider reports when he was fishing with his dad, is to just kind of pull the rod tip and then pick up the slack. Pull the rod tip, pick up the slack. That's my kind of retrieve with this spoon here, because it just allows it to wobble. And then that, as you're reeling up the slack, lets it flutter back down. And most of my hits come as I'm picking up that slack. I've got a good connection with my line. That redfish comes to hit it, and just I'm doubled up on one. So it's really nice to fish these spoons when the water's a little bit dirtier. But if I'm fishing in an area that's got a lot of oysters or other structure like that, it's nice to know I'm not going to get snagged up like I would with a paddle tail or some other subsurface presentation that's got a higher chance of getting hung up and stuff. Do you use the spoons a lot when you're fishing over in Mosquito Lagoon or those other areas?
I haven't really used spoons too much. They seem to do better for me like in the fall, but again, it's going to be pretty regional based depending on the type of area you're fishing. Over here, we don't really have too much grass, so I'm usually working something really close to the bottom in the sand, such as like the power prawn, because if you put it on a jig head, if you put one of these shrimp lures on a jig head or even a paddle tail, it'll hit the bottom and it'll create a little poof of sand. And that'll help draw the attention for the fish too, because they think, shrimp, they'll actually bury themselves in the sand. So if they see the sand moving around, they could think it's a crab, it's a shrimp, could be bait fish muddling around on the bottom. So that's why I like to go with these lures. But spoon, I seem to have better luck in the fall, and I'll throw it, in creeks and stuff like that where water is really dirty. I haven't really tried it in the summer in those areas though, so tough to say.
Yeah. Another interesting thing that I'm thinking about, some of the past reports that you've done, and I've seen this a lot in my area. It seems like, and probably by the time this comes out, this will be like when they're at their highest population. Have you seen a bunch of those little crabs swimming around, the ones that are like 1 or 2 inches long? And I've seen in some of your reports, you're using that crusty crab, that chase baits crab, and throwing it at those fish. I see a lot of redfish that are digging right now. I'm not seeing a ton, maybe early in the morning, they're up in the shallows, kind of sharking on some of the finger mullet. But I'm seeing a lot of fish that are kind of tailing and digging around. And I'm seeing a ton of those little tiny blue crabs. Have you found that those crab presentations work, better in the summer versus other times of year? Or is that, what are your observations there?
Yeah, the crab lures work really well. The only problem with them is you have to work them super slow. So if you're in an area with fish and they're tailing, that would be the best time to use it. Because like you said, they are, trying to dig up whatever's buried in the mud or the grass, whether it be crabs, shrimp. Also, we have what we call, kind of call them flatworms. They're worms that bury themselves in the ground or in the mud. And that's what those fish are usually dialed in on. So the crab lures, I like to throw them if I actually see, a pot of tailing fish, or I see a fish cruising the shoreline, toss it right in front of them, because it is such a small profile. It won't spook them as much as like a paddle tail or something like that.
Yeah, no, I mean, I see these little redfish running around with all these black drum too. It's like they kind of mix in these big schools, and you'll see them working shorelines, and it's something really interesting. I don't tend to see it too much. It seems like in the fall, the black drum and the reds separate and you get two different schools. But this time of year, I mean, I was just fishing last week, and I was pulling, puppy drum out of a school of, hundreds of black drum. Couldn't get the black drum to eat, but the reds were jumping all over the paddle tails. It's just an interesting phenomenon that I see. That's something to kind of keep in mind, that they kind of take on that behavior of a black drum when they're running with them. It seems like they get to digging a bunch. And I don't know. I don't personally have any of those crab lures. I've not personally used them, but I've seen you catch a ton. So I just thought that I would ask.
Yeah, I think it was last summer. I was fishing an area and I saw these basically big dark shadows that were swimming almost parallel with the shoreline. And I had the crab lure on because I was actually chasing black drum, and they ended up being redfish. I thought they were black drum, but I tossed it out there, let it sink. And as soon as they got close, I just raised a rod tip to drag it a little bit. And the fish came down, tailed on it. Got it all on video in one of my reports. It was pretty cool.
Yeah, I remember seeing that. That was awesome. So thinking of that as well, what bait would you say you see redfish key on the most in the summertime? If you had to choose one, or if you're split, I'll let you choose two.
One lure, or one
like one their actual forage, so that we can best imitate it with our artificial lures.
In my area, I'd have to say in the big, I don't know. It's kind of hard. In the beginning of summer, like late spring, we have a lot of shrimp running around. So shrimp lures would be the ticket. And then, middle of summer definitely would have to be bait fish like finger mullet, that type of presentation. Then later in the summer, definitely crab lures, blue crabs, those small little fiddler crab type of lures work really well.
No, yeah, that's good to kind of take note of, because I mean, as people start in the south, you move further north, those trends are kind of, they're definitely regional, but they follow the same pattern as you move further up the coastline. So we might see those heavy shrimp runs right now where folks that are in the Carolinas and Virginia might still have those patterns as their temperature is changing to what we deal with. I know it's all temperature related, what bait runs at what times, because it all has to do with, shrimp spawns or bait fish spawns, things like that. So people knowing what the trends are and what they can kind of expect to happen. Like right now, we're dealing with what seems to be like a lot of small mullet and a lot of small shad. That's like kind of that early summer, midsummer trend. But I'm seeing more and more of these crabs show up as well. So for folks that are a little bit further north, they might still be on the shrimp and they can expect to get into that shad and that mullet here soon. So just kind of take a note of that and mention it, I think is important, so people can know what they need to switch to if the baits that they've been using start to kind of take a downturn. So I think that's really good. But as you get kind of later in the day, maybe even going into evening fishing, what is your kind of last set of tackle that you're going to be throwing out for these reds during the day?
So later in the day, when the sun's about to go down, it goes right back to what I was throwing in the morning. I'll switch back to topwater. It's not going to be as good of a bite because the water's been heating up all day. So the water's going to be at its warmest. So if you can find those areas that have mostly been in the shade, for example, the sun rises in the east, sets on the west. So you got to think when the sun is going down on the west, that west shoreline is going to have the most shade leading up to the evening. So there's a good chance that water is going to be a little bit cooler and you can find fish there. And that's where I would throw top water. And same thing, going back to the paddle tail, something a little bit more subsurface if they're not fully committing to something up on top.
No, I like the point that you made on where the sun sets, because I definitely see redfish prefer shorelines that have, more shade in the summertime, whether the sun's rising, setting, they seem to know where they can get the best conditions to basically be living, because they're cold blooded. They have to adapt to the temperature that's around them. And be where they can get an easy meal. So if you can find those convergence points where there's bait and cool water, that's where I find the most fish for sure. Is there like a specific spot that you're looking at for redfish in the summertime that, you can pick it out regardless of where you're going? What is the general trend you're looking for where you can go over to that spot with all the lures we've talked about today and you're likely going to find redfish? What would be, I guess, types of structure, type of spot, depth, that kind of all those conditions? What are you looking for reds in the summer?
For me personally, where I'm fishing, because we don't have much seagrass, the majority of the structure those fish are going to be honed in on is going to be right up on the shoreline. That's where the crabs are going to be. That's where the shrimp like to hang out, especially muddy bottom that's close to shoreline. So mangrove shorelines or shorelines that have a lot of debris on them, whether it be dead trees or even docks. Depending on your region, docks can be a really good place to look for those fish as well, because it provides structure, shade, and a place for the bait to go and a place for them to feed. So I would be looking for those shallow shorelines that lead off to a little deeper drop. You have these flats that push right up close to shorelines, and they're the same depth all the way down the shoreline. And then as you get out maybe 50, 75, 100 yards, that's where it drops off to a little bit deeper. So those fish have the option of either pushing up to the shoreline for shade and to feed, or they can go down to the deeper area where it might be a little bit cooler.
Yeah, no, that's pretty much the same trend I'm seeing. We've got more seagrass here in Texas, but I know even, looking into Florida and areas on the east kind of coastal bend going up towards the Carolinas. Even I remember when I was fishing up in that area, it's same situation where you look for a flat that's close to deeper water, whether it's coming off of intercoastal channels, or here in Texas, we've got some really big wide open bays that border some kind of shallow flats on either side. So you've got that west shoreline you're talking about and that kind of east southeast shoreline. And early in the morning, I love starting off on the east southeast, and then I definitely go to the west later on in the day. But I do find that the highest concentrations of fish are in those kind of point areas where it's the edge of that flat where it meets the point of a bay or an intercoastal channel. Preferably if there's some spoil islands along that way those fish can push those banks and pin the bait kind of against that wall of the shoreline. Because redfish, they're a pretty aggressive predator, but they're not as agile as mullet are. So they kind of need that extra shoreline to help funnel that bait and attack it. But I think that's really the general trend, is look for those shallow flats close to deeper water, whether you have seagrass or not. I think seagrass is very helpful if you're in an area that has it. But as Tony pointed out, not all areas have them, but he still has a lot of success even fishing those zones that are the seagrass is not present in. So I think that pretty much goes over everything that there is for tackle for redfish in the summer. Is there anything that we missed, Tony?
Not that I could think of. If anything, maybe summertime can be a really good time to switch over to maybe some cut bait, something that the fish don't have to chase down. They just have to hone in on, and it's a nice, easy meal for them, especially if it's middle of the day. When artificials just aren't getting it done, it's hot out. You don't want to be sitting there casting and wearing yourself out. So if you're just trying to catch fish and you know where they're at, but they're not hitting artificials, switch over to cut bait. I used to either cut ladyfish, or get yourself some big mullet and cut them up into chunks, anywhere from like 2 to 3 inch chunks. Put it on a 5/0 circle hook, and you can either free line it depending on how deep or how much current you have, or you can put a little egg sinker on there, keep it down close to the bottom. And we do sell those hooks on our shop page at fishstrong.com. You can pick some up there. Also leader, if you need that, you can find it all on there. And I think that would pretty much be it. Cut bait is always my last resort. Sometimes I'll stop at the bait shop on my way to where I'm fishing, grab a pack of frozen mullet, throw it in a cooler, just in case, because you never know. And speaking of bait shop, that was another thing I want to talk about, what you were talking about when you're basically trying to figure out what type of bait's in your area. One thing I'll do if I'm at the bait shop picking up a pack of hooks or whatever I need for the day, take a look at what's in the bait tanks. If they have fiddler crabs in stock, that's probably a good indicator that there's a lot of fiddler crabs running around on the shorelines right now. If there's a lot of blue crab in their tanks, there's probably a decent amount of blue crab around. If they have a lot of finger mullet, they have croakers or pinfish, because that changes throughout the year what they actually have in stock. And that could be a good indicator as to what you should be either throwing if you want to use live bait, or what you should be imitating if you're throwing lures.
No, that's a really good point. I couldn't agree more with the use of live bait in the summer. As fish get lethargic with the heat, it seems like it gets a little bit more difficult to target them with lures, especially past that kind of 10, 11 o'clock range, unless you're sight fishing for them and you can really put that lure right where it needs to be to get a reaction strike. It's very hard to blind cast for these fish, but I have started to use more live bait myself. In fact, I'll give a little bit of a live bait presentation here that I really like, is the old popping cork. We actually just added these 4 Horsemen corks to the shop, but I like putting shrimp under these and fishing them near kind of shallow structure. I know with some of the cut bait presentations, you're putting them kind of closer to deep water, right?
Yeah. So I'm looking for, we like to call them highways, where redfish like to basically just cruise down, going from spot to spot, usually like a deeper trough that's close to a shoreline, or the edge of a flat where it's a little bit deeper. Those fish use those areas as basically highways, and just drop a bait down there, wait for those fish to come.
No, yeah, it's easy money for redfish. Is just find where they're moving, predict that, and just set up and wait for them to run that pathway. Most times they run a specific kind of perimeter around an area. Even the smaller ones, they'll work a shoreline and then recycle right back to the back, run that shoreline and go right back to the back. I've seen it happen on the jetties where they're actually on the surface running those jetties. They'll move back around really fast. They're right back at the point. It's a pretty interesting concept that I don't see trout do that very much. They don't seem to run perimeters. They just kind of sit up, post up, and ambush. But redfish are kind of weird like that. It's almost like there's a fence that they're working right along the edges of. And that's kind of why I like this popping cork, because as they're working that perimeter, they're looking for some sort of food. I'll work this up against a rock wall, maybe the jetty, whatever it may be. And it just creates something that as those fish are kind of moving around that perimeter, they can zone in on a little bit of splashing. And right under that splash, there's a nice little shrimp for them to grab. But yeah, I think that's pretty much everything you need as far as tackle goes for reds in the summertime. You've got your artificial presentations, your live bait for later in the day. And we've even talked about some really good spots for you to go target them. But I think all the lures we've talked about actually everything we have in the shop at 20% off for Salt Strong insiders. If you are an insider, you get a ton of awesome discounts in the shop on the plastics, the top waters, even a lot of the live bait stuff we've talked about, and all these spots that we talked about finding. You can see it really easily on our new Smart Fishing Spots app. We've got 3D views. You can see those depth highways really easily when you look at that. There's tons of really amazing stuff that we've got coming in that Smart Fishing Spots app. I know Tony has done a lot of really cool spot dissections, even showing you guys in your area where redfish are going to be. So definitely check all of that out at saltstrong.com. Tony, is there anything I'm leaving out here?
Not that I can think of. I think you nailed it.
Sweet, man. Sweet. Yeah, I think we've got folks set up to get out and get after some redfish this summer. So guys, thank you guys again so much for watching, and we will see you on the next video. And if you're new to Salt Strong, just know we're the #1 online fishing club in America, because we actually guarantee we're going to help you catch more fish, save money on tackle, and make friends fast. So thank you again so much for watching, and we're looking forward to seeing you in the Salt Strong Insider Club soon.